Hi, my name is Joshua Beatson. We're here at Everblack Tattoo Co in Sheffield. And today I'll be teaching you how to tattoo in my horror Blackwork style. We're going to be looking at doing a vampire portrait with some bioorganic elements. Let's go. So we're going to go over what's on my workstation. This never really changes. I do it the same with every tattoo I do. First we've got the inks. So I use Panthera black ink. I mix my own dilutions. Generally I just go black, a very dark, medium and a very light. Just so I get a nice range of contrasts and values throughout the tattoo. And then next we have needles. I use quadrant cartridges. Generally, I'll always use something like a 3 or a 5 liner, 5 and a 9 round, 7, 13, 17 magnums, soft edge. I generally like to use small needles just because I can saturate the skin better than with large. Then we've got hustle butter, so just some distilled water. The tattoo machine is the Aquas M1. It's just a very versatile machine. It works well for the style of work that I do and how I work with my hand speed. I've used plenty of other machines, but that's just the one that I prefer working with, and it's nice and comfortable. So that's everything that's on my workstation, so let's get into the stencil. Right, so next we're gonna apply the stencil. This is a 2-day piece that I'm working on. We've left it at a nice cut-off point so that I can easily line up the stencil to make sure everything fits again, and just so that I'm not going into yesterday's piece to make it more comfortable for the client. So I've disinfected and shaved the client's leg, and we're just gonna find a nice point to make some marks with a pen, just so I can get it lined up as well as I can. Once all that's ready, I'm just gonna get some stencil fluid and just put a generous amount on. Just make sure it's all worked into the skin and all that stuff. And then I'll leave it to dry for 30 seconds or something like that, just so it's not too wet. Generally, I'll either work with mostly it's a line drawing stencil, just so there's less carbon about. But if I'm being lazy, like I were today, I've used the Ghostline app, just so it gives me a clean stencil, but they can be quite heavy and quite messy sometimes. So I like to use just only a little bit of stencil fluid. I use the Butterlux one just because it's very strong. Once it's nice and rubbed in, just give it a little bit to dry. And then we get nice and stressed while trying to put this on straight. Nice and relaxed then. So for this I did the tattoo yesterday, and I've basically just left it completely empty up to the face's jawline, just because then that gives me like a nice point just to line everything up. If it's a few mil out, who cares? Zan will never know about it, and it's easy to make it up. I wouldn't really do it on a part of like the face, just because then if you get the stencil wrong the second day, you might not notice, and then you've just caused yourself a bit of a headache trying to adjust it mid-tattoo. But I'm not really too worried about like the background stuff, if that's not cleanly printed or if it's messy or anything. I'll probably just freehand it anyway. So I'm only really concerned with just making sure the face is nice and printed, just to make my life easier. Which is not too bad. Cool. Afterwards, I'll generally just get it a little dry with a towel and then spray some stencil stuff spray on it, just to try and help keep that stencil on a little bit better. That's the only problem is with using like stencil apps and everything, it can be quite messy. Right, so we're gonna get started. I'll be starting basically and working so that I don't smudge my stencil, just because that's a nightmare. So I'm going to be starting with this outer focus sort of background hair section. I'll be using like a curved mag, so I'm using like a 13 mag, just because I don't want anything too defined. I want this quite out of focus and pushed back. Generally, I never really change my machine speed or anything like that. I keep it quite stable, so it's like hertz, it's like 72 hertz. But I have the machine turned quite more on a punchy motor speed, so that I can get it saturated, but I can use a slow, steady hand speed. And I'm mostly just brushing some grazing just to get like a soft edge on everything. I use the side of a mag quite a lot if I need to, but because all this is going to be quite soft and out of focus, I'll generally undo it with mags rather than any lining or anything like that, because I want to keep most of that for the face. So we're working on this 2-day piece with Zan. Generally, I'll always just work either, if I'm doing a 2-day tattoo, I don't like to go into what I did the first day on the second day, apart from white highlights. So I'll just pick a nice point where I can finish, and it's not going to be so much a painful area to start again, and that I'm not like halfway through a face or anything like that. I'll try and find like a clean line to stop the tattoo at, just so it makes it easier for everyone. Yeah, so generally my hand changes with whatever I'm tattooing, whether it's speed and stuff like that, or pressure and stretch. So like now it's on shin near enough, so I'm not really stretching at all, because I don't want it to be too defined anyway. So usually for this, it's like just like an easy back and forth motion just to get everything kind of saturated, but nothing too harsh, because I want this to be quite soft on this section. So currently, we're still working on the hair. Generally, I'll try and complete a section like 90% done or 95% done as I'm moving along, just so that, you know, it's more comfortable for the client. I can just fully concentrate on an area until I'm happy with it, and I'm not going to be coming back to it later on when it's quite sore and everything. Especially on like a double day piece, you want to try and just be as nice to your client as you can in that regard. So I don't really work like, I wouldn't say I do dark to light or light to dark. I just kind of do what I feel is going to be right for the section that I'm doing. So sometimes that'll be putting the lightest tones in first, other times it'll be putting the blacks in first. With this, like I'm doing the hair and everything, and I want it to be quite soft and out of focus. So I'm generally probably going to just do all the lighter tones first, and then I can come in and sort of shape it and do the individual forms of like hair and everything once I've got that tone down. But it does just change depending what I'm doing at the minute. I just use Panthera because it's the blackest ink that I've personally used. It's a nice rich tone, so I just make my own. I don't really have like a set amount of like dilutions that I use. I just try and keep it, you know, quite high contrast. So using black as most of my work, I use like the XXX tribal black for my blacks, just because it's really dark. And then I just try and do like a dark tone, quite a medium mid-tone, so like, you know, like 50-50 with distilled water. And then my light, it depends how light I want to go, whether it's with my reference or the client's skin tone. So that can be like one drop, or it could be a couple of drops. It's just more down to the client's skin. So now I'm sort of coming like towards the mouth area. My stencil's not amazing, so I am sort of mapping in a little bit, but I'm only really doing like the structures that are going to be quite defined. So there's like these mandibles and like the teeth and everything. So I'm just using like a 3 round liner, just to keep it small, because I don't really want this to be a definitive like edges and stuff like that. But it will still give me a little edge. So when it comes to like small bits, I like to use round shaders quite a lot, because they're very precise. I can get all the textures that I like doing with like rounds and small liners and stuff. So a lot of it's like stippling, scratching. There's no real like specific way I do stuff. It's just kind of make some marks, see what looks cool, and obviously just making sure that I'm doing it so that it's going to last and heal. Because you don't want to be like spending all your time doing little details and tiny little bits that are just not going to be there once the piece is healed. So I generally am a little bit more abrupt with the way I tattoo. Leave a lot of like skin and leave a lot of textures and needle marks, just because by the time it's all healed, everything will smoothen out a little bit and it'll get a bit softer naturally. Hand movements and everything really do depend on what like texture that I'm trying to get. So a lot of it is like almost like a scribble or like a stipple, but then some bits will be sculpting lines, and then other bits will be sort of cross-hatched. It really does change sort of every section that I do. So it's just that I'm using a small needle just to get this, because it's nice and tight. I'm going to saturate the skin properly. Yeah, so I'm going to be starting at like the bottom now. I'm going to come into the jawline, and basically just so I don't wipe everything off, although I already am doing. Again, mostly just using small needles. So I'm going to be using like some 5-round shader, 5 liner, all that kind of stuff. Just basically building up textures as I go. So I'll be starting off with, I'm doing like some of like these like mandibles that are coming out of the woman's mouth. And again, I try and complete everything as I'm going, unless I really do need to map something in, which I might in a second, just because this stencil's not holding up amazingly. So at the minute I'm using like a 5 round, and I do a lot of textures and everything with my round shader and my liner, just because I can kind of use it like a pencil. I can get on the edge and the corners. I can do a lot of stippling with it, and I just think it looks nice. It's more textured, and I prefer a more textured tattoo to something that's smooth, because obviously as like a tattoo heals and ages, it's going to smooth out anyway. So I'd rather it be over textured, because I know in a year's time it'll have softened up a little bit. Quite often I will do some textures and then I'll smooth it out on top with like a 7 mag or a 13 mag or whatever I need, depending on the size. But generally I do like 90% of the tattoo with round shaders and small magnums. So I think something that's always stuck with me is, it was actually probably the opposite of advice that I got, and that's, I think that I got told that my work was looking too dark, too much black, and so for a while I actually went to doing stuff too light, and just because it looked nicer on a picture and looked nicer on Instagram and social media and everything. But then I think as you develop and you realise that actually everything that this is for longevity purposes. So the best advice is, just for me, what I'd say is to just don't be scared of using black. Use a lot of black and have a high range of contrast, because soft tattoos, yeah, they look nice and pretty for a picture on Instagram, but it's not a real tattoo. It's not going to look like a good tattoo in person once it's healed. And just another good piece of advice that I got told was more just about committing to smashing the tattoo in. You know, don't be soft and soft because you want something to look soft. You've still got to put pigment in the skin. So that's more down to, you know, your values that you use in a tattoo. You've got to, if you want it to look soft, make sure you're using a softer value, a lighter value, but that it's still saturated in the skin. So generally when I'm like looking at contrasts in this piece, I will try and use white. I'll try and use skin as white so that I'm not doing a high amount of actual white highlights, just because our white ages in the skin. Unless you're perfectly pale and you never go into the sun, white's always going to look a little bit milky, a little bit creamy. So generally I will just try and keep a nice amount of open skin, and then only really using white for like the pinpoint highlights. But I'm guilty of not leaving enough open skin, and you know, you'll do a tattoo and I'll think, wow, I should have left a little bit more open skin, because it's breathing room, you know, it helps hold everything together just as much as black does. So I think we're doing stuff like teeth. There's got to be points where, you know, I want these to be out of focus, I want them to be soft, so I'm going to use like looser hand movements or a lighter grey to make sure that I'm getting these nice softer edges. Whereas then the ones that I want, like the big fangs, I want them to be quite in focus, so I'm going to put like a nice line around some of them. It might be a small line, but that'll just then bring out some nice sharpness. I try and always knock down the value in teeth and up the contrast a little bit, so that I'm leaving a nice amount of open skin, just so that way, because you can put white in them, but that's then going to be a lot of white, and that's too much white for my liking. So if I can leave, say, 60% of most of these as open skin, they're just going to look more vibrant as a tattoo. It'll age better. And again, I'm not outlining every single one of them. I'm only doing that for the ones that I definitely want to be defined, because otherwise then everything's going to be in focus in the foreground. Whereas the ones at the back, I want them nice and pushed back, so they'll be done softer with more of a looser hand. So obviously this being a 2-day piece, we kind of getting to the point where it's a little bit uncomfortable for the client. You know, we've already done his ankle, we've been working on his shin, back of his calf, all quite sensitive places. We're trying to make it as comfortable as we can for the client. So it's important not to obviously compromise on the quality of the tattoo, or I'm not really changing how I tattoo. I'm just maybe going to be a little bit slower, have a few little breaks, have some stretches when my client needs it. And that's an important thing. You don't want to panic and rush. I'm not going to start doing stuff that'd be any different because it's hurting the client. I'm just going to try and be a little bit nicer, take my time a little bit more. If he needs more breaks, he needs more breaks. It's an important thing just to do the tattoo as you normally would. Just be a bit mindful that it sucks, because it's a tattoo. So we'll be doing exactly the same. I'm going to tattoo it just as I have been. I'm just going to maybe be a bit sweeter to my client. It does happen, you know, especially when you're doing like multiple day pieces. People hit walls in their pain tolerances. You do some areas that are absolutely fine, others not nice to sit through and get tattooed. Obviously the client's always going to try the best, but there's no set way of how this would go. So what I'm going to do is work the normal way that I would. I'm still working from sort of bottom to top. If it gets to a point where Zan's in a lot of pain, then we might just have to call it early and finish it another time. And if that's the case, I always ask for like give me half an hour. Let me know if you're getting to that point, so that I can then plan where I'm going to stop, to ensure that I'm not doing anything that's going to jeopardize the tattoo. So I'll find like lines where I can re-stencil, or I can easily draw on freehand. So I'm looking for like a line as to where I'm going to go to today, and generally I'll always look in the stencil of the design as to where's going to be a nice place to stop. I've got a good amount done. I'm not going to be having to re-stencil important features like the eyes. I'd never want to get one eye done and then have to try and re-stencil the eye again, because it's probably never going to go 100%. So I'm seeing this sort of like this tooth that I've drawn in. That's quite a nice point where if I think I can get to that, I can easily just freehand or stencil up this sort of section. So I feel like that's a nice line for me to work towards. I'll get all the important features done, and then if we need to stop and we need to pick this up another session, it's not going to cause too much issues. So we've come back after a little break, and now we're going to be working again into the mouth area, bringing it towards this sort of cheek where I've put all this, trying to do like a mutated flesh, ripped, torn up flesh textures and everything. Generally when I'm doing these sort of areas, and most of my tattooing, I don't really like to do a traditional process of lining it, blacking, shade. I prefer doing it on the fly as I'm going, just because I've done it before in the past where I might have done some lining, and then by the time I've come to shade, I've realised I didn't want it to be as strong and as sharp. So I'd rather do that as I go, and if I want a nice sharp definitive line or an edge, I can then put it in whilst I'm shading and whilst I'm completing the section that I'm working on at the moment. So again, I'm just using like small rounds. So I'm using a 5 round shader, just to get all these sort of like tight little areas in, but I can stipple them out really easily. It's not as definitive as a liner, and I just like all the textures that we can do with these needles. I'm not going to do like a variant, I'm not going to do a gradient over this with the round. I will come in with a mag if I want to push it back a little bit, make it a bit softer. But for most of it, because it's quite tight, I want all these wrinkles and sort of fleshy bits. A round shader is ideal for this, for me personally, but everyone is different, and I think you've just got to find out what works for you, what works for your hand speed and the style of tattooing that you like doing. I've spoken to people that do everything with mags, people that don't use any rounds, and they do some, amazing tattoos. I just like this because for me it's more like a pencil. I've tried a lot of needles, and I always just sort of come back to Quadrant. Personally, I just like them. They're nice and sharp, they're very sharp. I can be very abrupt. If I put a stipple in, I put a mark in, it's there. It's not too soft, which a few of the brands that I've used in the past, they can make them, they're quite soft, or the needles, pins are quite close together. I prefer a bit more breathing room and a bit more textures to be within my needle marks. I don't like bug pins. I want to see needles, I want to see the marks that I put down, and I want there to be a difference between my mags and my round shaders or my liners. Whereas bug pins, everything just looks a little bit soft for my liking. I think they're more suited to portraits perhaps, or if you're doing Chicano and you want everything to be really soft and really smooth, whereas I don't. For the machine, I use it's an Acus M1. I've used it for maybe like a year or two now. It just works really well for the style of tattooing that I do, for my preferences. I've used pretty much most machines that are out there at the moment. I've used like FKs and Cheyennes and all that stuff. I do use some more traditional hybrid rotaries. I've got a few Dan Cuban machines or a few coil machines, but they're more geared towards if I'm doing specifically big lines or heavy black work, big mags, whereas this is my daily machine. I personally like it because you can change more things than you can on most pen style machines. So you can change the torque of the motor, so I can have it nice and punchy but running slow. And for me, that's perfect for this kind of work. I can have it so I can pick up needle marks, or I can make it softer, which doesn't really happen, but. So I'm going to be working into these textures on the cheek, and I want it to be, again, quite textured, into like a smooth gradient towards this sort of lost edge, just so we can get some nice focus on this front portion at face. So again, like around shaders and that, I'm going to be doing more of like a stippling, whip kind of movement. So I'm using like a lot of throw, and I'm just sort of making marks as and where I feel like it needs it. So that way it's going to be more smaller needlework, it's going to be more in focus, sharper, and then where I can get back here, I can push some edges back and use some bigger magnums. So generally I've not changed anything with the machine, it's just my hand movement's a little bit different. I put the throw out a little bit more. Whether it's a back and forth or a circular, it really does just mix up, and I change in between which sort of movements I am doing as to what finish that I want. So if it's something like a little bit more condensed, I'm going a bit more circular motions, and I'm just using like dark pigments, just because I want to leave some gaps in the skin. So one piece of advice that I'd give to anyone learning how to tattoo is probably to get off your iPads. Nothing beats traditional drawing when it comes to like transferring skills from artwork to tattooing. Graphite pencils are probably the closest thing that you can do. That will give you a good understanding and a good foundation for when it comes to making a tattoo. Whereas iPad's digital media, it's got its place, but it's not really going to be beneficial for you as an artist that's learning. So obviously graphite, it's probably the most relatable, in my opinion, it's the most relatable thing to tattooing, because once it's there, the mark's there. I always recommend people to draw in graphite with no rubbers, no blending stumps, just pure graphite pencils. You will learn how to make marks and achieve different textures. It can be really difficult, but it's something that pays off, and it's easily transferable to tattooing. You can do the same with painting, you know, for like colour theory and everything like that. And that's why I always recommend like not using like iPads and Procreate and stuff. It's great for designs and it just makes things quick and easy. But learning how to mix a colour with paint, you'll learn that information and it'll stay with you rather than just colour swatching. It's fine for tattooing because you've got to make things fast and a process so that you're not spending hours trying to do something when you can do it quick. Generally when I'm doing like certain areas, I want it to be quite rich and saturated, and you'll only really get that by having good separation of your tones. So you know, that's why I like a really dark and I like a really light. Everything looks angry when it's done. It looks a little too dark, but then this will fade and heal to a nice soft edge, and it'll just make everything look a little bit more richer. So like with the tones, you know, I'm using everything. I'm using like my dark and my medium, but it's a saturated medium, and that'll give you that kind of like velvety look, similar to opaques. I think it's easier to achieve it with opaques, but it will give it a little bit more of a rendered finish, where I think grey wash, it's a little bit more natural. Obviously, you've got a little bit more breathing room when the skin heals. I just think it looks nicer and softer, but with more texture. Whereas opaque work, I use it sometimes, but it's all a little bit more refined and a bit smooth for my liking. So I'd rather use just a higher contrast black and grey palette, and I think it just looks better. So now I'm working on the forehead and I'm going to be starting the eye soon. Basically, because it's a big tattoo, the client's having a little bit of sensitivity on the skin. It's a little bit of swelling, obviously with being a 2-day piece, which is completely normal and it happens. What I'm probably going to try and do is sort of like get to a nice point where I can call it a day and easily add on to it in the next session. So we're going to probably we're at a nice point where we can get to today is doing the eye, the forehead, and then using this tooth as a nice frame where I can just, next time we can stencil it back on, not going to have to worry about any sort of distortion or messing anything up with the proportions or anything. So what we're going to do is just focus on like the forehead and this remaining eye. Obviously we're trying to keep it as comfortable as we can. There is quite a lot of swelling going on, which does happen a lot on like calves and lower limbs, just where the circulation and water retention, everything like that. So it's completely normal and to be expected with pieces like this on areas like this. You know, it's 2 days, it's a lot of work to get done. It's a lot of work for the body to take as well. So I'm gonna do everything as I normally would. I'm not gonna map anything in still. I'll probably just get to a line, do a grey line, and then leave it at that. Maybe do some white highlights if it's feeling comfortable. And in certain areas, because of like the swelling, I'll probably want to jump back into it at some point, do a little bit more texture, push a little bit of stuff back, add a bit more depth. I'm just cautious about overworking the skin and causing too much trauma. So yeah, so we're just going to start again, probably at like this bottom eye, work up towards this bit and then carry on. So basically we're coming towards the end of this session. I'm just working on a little bit of this hair section. Most of this, because I want the focus to be on the face, I'm just keeping this really light and really smooth and soft and everything. I'm only really using my lighter tones, still saturating the greys because I want it to be rich when it's healed. A lot of this stuff is just, everyone's got their own technique for it. Me personally, I'm just sort of side magging. It works pretty well. It means that it's not too sharp. It'll be nice and out of focus and sort of pushed back. I'm just using a mixer like a 13 and a 7 mag. On the reference when I was designing it, you know, it's a lot more individual hair strands and all that stuff, which is nice, but I want it to draw to this and not be muddled up by all this in detailed textured hair and everything. So I'm just going to keep it nice and simple, simplify it compared to reference a little bit more than it is, and just keep it smooth. Obviously we're not finishing the piece today, but it is quite a big tattoo, so we're just going to get to a point where it looks nice as it is. It'll be a bit of a floating head, but I'm sure my client won't mind. We'll get it done soon. Because obviously what we're going to do is, it will be extended and we're going to do some of the like bioorganic bone structures and stuff, similar to what we did down at the bottom of the ankle. That'll be all the way up to the back of the knee, outside at knee and all that stuff. So if I can get the hair done, finish the forehead, and then I'm probably going to come in and do like my base whites. Generally I don't like using a lot of whites, mainly just for longevity's sake. So it's really only going to be in the bits that I want really in focus, like the eyes and the teeth, potentially a little bit on the lips. My client's got pale skin, which always helps with white, but I still don't like to use a lot. I'd rather open skin and just really pinpoint the white highlights that I want to be as much in focus as possible. So we've pretty much got to end the session now. Obviously we've not finished the piece, but I'm pretty happy with what we've got done. Because of the placement, the location, we've had a little bit of swelling. So there's a few areas that I actually want to hit again, which can happen. So there's just a few bits we're going to jump into. I will probably re-hit some areas next time once it's all healed and settled, just so I can see how like my values are and my textures and everything. So I'll probably want to come in and put a little bit more depth in this cheek, but obviously it's a tattoo, we're on a time limit as to how much we can work on the skin and everything. So I'm just going to come in, sharpen a few little bits up, add a little bit of depth, but I'm not going to push it further than it needs to be. And then basically it's a little bit of white, and then we'll leave it, let it heal, come back next time, get the piece finished. Yeah, I'm just going to there's a few bits that I just want to sharpen up and everything, like some of the teeth and stuff. So I'm just coming in with like a 5 liner, just because I don't want anything too bold. I just want to give like a nice edge to a few sections, just around like the teeth. And then what I'll probably do is come in with like a mag, and just push a little bit more black over the top of some of these textures that I've done earlier, just so they're sort of set back a little bit. So we're going to be doing the whites now. I'm going to be subjective as to where I put white in the piece, mostly so I can see how it ages and heals and maybe come back and reassess it next time. So we're just going to focus on like the lips, teeth, a little bit in eyes, and just anywhere where I want it to look wet and just give a different texture. I'm only really going to be using like a 5 liner just for the whites because I don't want anything too big, and pretty much work exactly the same as I do normally. So generally my method for doing white highlights is I like to wait till the very end, obviously, because I don't want to smear black into it or greys or anything like that, so I'll make sure I get a good clean down. And just working slow and steady. I don't really use like mags or anything like that for whites because I don't generally do a lot of them in a tattoo. I like to keep it quite open, more open skin than white highlights. But I just keep like a slow, steady hand. Make sure everything's saturated before I move on. Let it bleed out for a minute, have a look at it, make sure that it's saturated. And yeah, just take your time with it, really. Right, so we're pretty much done for today. We're at a nice point to leave it where we can continue next time quite easily. I'm basically just going to drop the stencil back on top, do a bit of freehanding. We've had like a little look over everything. I'm pretty happy with where we're at. There'll be a few points I think I'll want to reassess next time, push a little bit of blacks back into some spaces, potentially add a little bit more texture with my small needles. But we've done a little bit of white, I'm happy with it. The skin is a little bit angry, but it's not too bad. So what we're going to do now is just spray some alcohol on it, just try and get it to bleed out, especially the whites, because obviously we've just done them at last, and they are quite angry. So we're going to spray it down, give it 5 to 10 minutes, and then we're going to get some videos. Right, so now we're just about to wrap him up. I've sprayed a little bit of alcohol on his skin, and that just helps obviously with the bleeding, tightens his pores out, and that'll just help us get the second skin on a little bit easier and better, make sure it sticks nicely. So I usually either use second skin or use something like tattoo armor. It does depend on the client and what they're going to be doing over the next few days as to which is going to be the best. So for this piece we're going to be using like a second skin. So I'm just using Hustle Butters, it's like a matte second skin stuff, and it's just really easy. It's less work for the client to do. I'll always give them a couple of pieces to take home in case they need to patch any of it up or something. Let's see if you can stretch your ankle a bit for me. So basically when I'm using any second skin, I like to make sure I've left a good amount of space of untattooed skin around it, just so it can stick nicely. Obviously areas like this you're going to get bubbles and everything, but that don't really matter too much. I do prefer using like a few smaller pieces of the second skin, just because I think that when it's too big, there's more chance for it like coming off and warping and everything. So just a couple of smaller pieces, make sure I've got everything covered. And now I'm going to spin him around. I'm going to get this back section. So if you can turn a little bit, Zam. And then don't forget to put it over the hairs, because that always just feels nice. And then just give everything a firm press, make sure it's all stuck. Check everything over. Yeah, it's all good. And that's the tattoo finished, guys. There we go. Thanks very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. If you'd like to check out more of my work, my Instagram is @JoshuaBeatsonTattoo. If you're interested in finding more of my process, you can always message me and discuss a seminar. Don't forget to like and subscribe to Killer Ink's YouTube.